In my daily practice with self-inquiry is a great help, but I found myself or in the awareness space, so beautiful, silence, sweet, lovely, or I get lost in the experience. And I thought that is a question of practice. But other times, and also yesterday, you explain that the infinite cannot be with the finite. A finite mind cannot be in the infinite and vice versa. Like the infinite cannot contain the finite, like a finite mind.
I said more that the infinite cannot know the finite directly.
Yes, and also the opposite.
And the opposite, yes. And the infinite and the finite cannot know the infinite either directly or indirectly.
And there I cannot understand. There I stop because how can my finite mind be together with awareness in my daily life or my experience, or if I am in the consciousness, in the knowing, it's difficult to deal with the daily experience for me. So I would like to help from you.
Okay. Okay, so I need to introduce you to John Smith and King Lear for this question. Many of you, is anyone here not familiar with John Smith and King Lear? Okay, a few people, all right. So just briefly, apologies for those of you that know them well. John Smith is an actor. He lives a peaceful life at home, and each night he goes to his theatre to perform a play. And on this evening he's performing King Lear. So he goes to his theatre, he dresses up in King Lear's clothes, he rehearses King Lear's lines, and the play begins. To all intents and purposes, he becomes, as it were, King Lear. He plays his part. He is, of course, miserable because of his relationship with his daughters. And at the end of the play, so fully involved in King Lear's drama has John Smith become that he forgets to, at the end of the play, he forgets to revert to being John Smith at the end of the play. So his friend comes to visit him in his dressing room to congratulate him on his wonderful performance, and instead of finding him peaceful and happy, he finds him upset and miserable. So his friend says, well, why are you miserable? And then King Lear starts telling him about his relationship with his daughters. But his friend says to him, don't be silly, you're not King Lear. Don't you remember who you really are? And so King Lear starts telling him who he is. He starts telling him about being the King of England and the father of 3 daughters, etc. And his friend says to him, no, but those are just your thoughts. And what are you before you assumed all those lines or all those thoughts? And King Lear thinks for a while, and then he starts describing his feelings. And his friend says to him, no, but those are not really your feelings. Those feelings are not essential to you. They visit you, they leave. And King Lear doesn't know it, but his friend is teaching him self-inquiry. So King Lear traces his experience back. Each question that his friend asks him about himself, he goes deeper and deeper into himself through all the layers of thought and feeling and memory and sensation, until at some point there is this sudden recognition, I am John Smith. And at that moment, his suffering leaves him, because the cause of his suffering was not King Lear's relationship with his daughters, obviously. It was that he had forgotten who he truly was. So, King Lear is the character that each of us is or seems to be, and John Smith is the being who we really are, our real self, prior to our thoughts, our feelings, our activities, our relationships, the roles we play in life, etc. So the important thing about this, and also the very nice thing about this illustration is that there is no difference between the self of John Smith and the self of King Lear. John Smith is not one person and King Lear another person. King Lear is simply a self-assumed limitation that John Smith freely assumes in order to play his part as the King of England. But in doing so, John Smith temporarily loses himself in the character and seems to cease being John Smith, and as a result seems to become King Lear. But there is in fact there are not two selves, a real self and a false self. There is just one self. The only self present is John Smith. So the only self present in us is infinite consciousness. The self of each of us is infinite consciousness, God's infinite being, the only being or the only self there is. So it is not King Lear that has the recognition, I am John Smith. In other words, in the form of King Lear cannot know, I am John Smith, because as long as he is King Lear, he feels that he is King Lear. It is John Smith that has the recognition, I am John Smith. So King Lear can never have the experience, I am John Smith, because as soon as the experience, I am John Smith appears, King Lear ceases to be. In fact, King Lear was never there to begin with, so he doesn't even cease to be. This is why the Sufis refer to not only the passing away of the ego, but they refer to the passing away of the passing away of the ego. If there was such a thing as an ego, a separate self, then that separate self would have to pass away in order for the real self to be recognized. But to suggest that the ego or the separate self has to pass away is to credit the ego with too much existence of its own. So that's why they speak of the passing away of the idea of the passing away of the ego. There is no real character called King Lear that has to pass away in order for John Smith's presence to be revealed. King Lear is simply an imaginary and temporary, self-assumed limitation that John Smith freely assumes in order to play his role. So it is John Smith that knows the kingdom of England and the relationship with his three daughters through the agency of King Lear. So John Smith needs the agency of King Lear if he wants to know about the kingdom of England. But King Lear cannot know the experience I am John Smith. Only John Smith can have the experience I am John Smith. So infinite consciousness, John Smith, knows the experience of the world through the agency of each of our minds, but each of our minds cannot know I am infinite consciousness, because the moment we have the knowledge I am infinite consciousness, there is no longer an apparent self there. It is consciousness alone that knows consciousness. It is awareness alone that knows I am aware. And the knowledge I am aware is not an extraordinary, mystical experience that a few enlightened or special people have. The experience I am aware is the simplest, most obvious, and most intimate experience there is. In other words, the knowledge I am aware, the knowledge that each of us has, I am aware, or simply the knowledge I am, that intimate, familiar, obvious knowledge that each of us has, I am, is, in religious language, God's knowledge of himself shining in each of our minds. It is never the person that has the experience I am. It is only our essential being that can say I am. And that essential being is not limited by the qualities of experience. It is shared by all of us. It is infinite, self-aware being that shines in each of our minds as the knowledge I am, or as God's presence in religious language. So there's no question of a finite mind knowing who we essentially are, because the finite mind will always superimpose its own limitations on everything that it knows, and everything that it knows will, as a result, appear in conformity with the limitations of the mind through which it is known. So the finite mind can never know who or what we truly are. Only what we truly are can know what we truly are. And what we truly are is simply pure awareness. Before that awareness, it has been qualified by experience. And that is not an extraordinary, mystical, spiritual experience. It is the most simple, obvious, intimate experience that everybody has, but which in most cases is eclipsed by experience. That is why it is said that I, or I am, is the highest mantra. You take the thought I, or the thought I am, and you allow the mind to be invited to the experience to which that thought refers. Right there is our essential being, or God's infinite being, shining in the midst of our experience.